Paying interest on reserve balances. It's more significant than you think. By Scott Fullwiler. The accommodative nature of the Fed's operations and interest payment on reserve balances. In the federal funds market, banks borrow and lend reserve balances held in reserve accounts at the Fed. Most of the trades are accomplished either through pre-existing lines of credit or arranged via brokers. The Fed uses open market operations, overdrafts provided automatically whenever a bank's reserve account moves into negative balance, and overnight loans to ensure the quantity of reserve balances circulating is such that the federal funds rate remains as close as possible to the FOMC's target rate. Since reserve balances are liabilities on the Fed's balance sheet, banks in the aggregate have no effect upon their quantity. By definition, only changes in the Fed's balance sheet can alter the quantity of reserve balances. Footnote 2. Even more to the point, reserve balances are transferred from one member bank to another via simultaneous debit-credit by the Fed. Reserve balances never go anywhere else. End footnote. The Fed's necessary accommodation of the demand for reserve balances is obvious when one considers daily operations in the absence of reserve requirements. Without reserve requirements, banks hold non-interest-bearing reserve balances only to settle payments, such as checks drawn on customer accounts or Fedwire fund transfers for direct payments to other banks, the Treasury, or as settlement of netted clearinghouse transactions. In order to avoid the Fed's overdraft charges, discussed in Fullwiler 2003, banks desire to hold sufficient reserve balances to settle their net payment commitments for the day. A bank holding less than this amount would attempt to borrow more reserve balances, while one holding more would attempt to lend the excess. In the aggregate, too many or too few reserve balances circulating leads to wide swings in the federal funds rate, since such borrowing among banks does not affect the aggregate quantity of reserve balances. Too few balances could also threaten the smooth functioning of the payment system, which the Fed is charged in the Federal Reserve Act with protecting. Larger quantities of reserve balances do not fund more money creation, since there is no operative constraint on bank lending beyond the existence of willing, creditworthy borrowers. In other words, loans create deposits, while reserve balances only settle payments. Adding reserve requirements is simply one way to reduce potential volatility in the federal funds rate. First, reserve requirements require banks to hold more reserve balances and thereby reduce the likelihood of overnight overdrafts. Second, because reserve requirements are met on an average across a lengthy maintenance period, deficiencies or surpluses on most days can be offset later in the maintenance period. Together, these provide room for error for the Fed as it attempts to correctly forecast the demand for reserve balances at the target rate, Fullwiler 2003. However, reserve balances still do not fund money creation and are still necessarily supplied endogenously to accommodate banks' demand for them, albeit as a daily average across the maintenance period. Concerns expressed in recent years about increased variability in the federal funds rate due to falling required reserves, reviewed in Fullwiler 2003, or due to e-money related innovations to the payment system, reviewed in Fullwiler 2004, often did not consider the regulatory factors enabling such volatility in the first place. Specifically, the possible range of variability in the federal funds rate is determined by the spread between the rate the Fed pays on reserve balances and the rate the Fed charges for overnight overdrafts, hereafter referred to as simply the spread. The reserve balances have historically been non-interest bearing, while the Fed also strongly discouraged borrowing at the discount window to cover an overdraft, which themselves carry significant penalties if not covered by the end of the business day. The spread has effectively been very wide, The Fed had earlier relied on reserve requirements and its ability to correctly forecast the demand for reserve balances to keep federal funds rate volatility at manageable levels, though the volatility became less manageable in the late 1990s as banks avoided reserve requirements through use of retail sweep accounts, and the demand for reserve balances became more closely tied to less predictable settlement needs. Fullwiler 2003. Narrowing the spread itself by providing overnight loans to any bank at a modest penalty above the target rate and paying interest on reserve balances at a discount below the target rate is more direct and more effective at reducing volatility, as nations that have eliminated reserve requirements have shown. Woodford, 2001. In January 2003, the Fed abandoned its traditional discouragement of borrowing at the discount window. The Fed now lends to any qualifying bank desiring a loan at the primary lending rate, set as a 1% penalty above the federal funds rate. In its first year, the primary lending rate was predictably effective in limiting increases or capping the fund rate on days when strong upward pressures did emerge. Footnote 3. The New York Fed reported that in 2003, as measured by both the standard deviation and the daily trading range, average intraday volatility decreased, falling from 2002's already low levels. It added that the daily Fed funds high rate deviation exceeded 100 basis points on only one occasion in 2003, compared with 7 and 15 occasions in 2002 and 2001, respectively. End footnote. Paying interest on reserve balances at a rate set some fixed magnitude below the FOMC's target would obviously further contain potential volatility in the federal funds rate by setting a floor on how low the federal funds rate could fall. A substantially reduced spread in which the Fed set both bid and ask rates on federal funds would effectively make the Fed a real-time market maker in their federal funds market and would be the monetary policy implementation procedure most consistent with the Fed's necessary accommodation of the demand for reserve balances. That reserve balances only settle payments or meet reserve requirements means that the demand for them is insensitive to changes in the federal funds rate. Though there is overlap, this point can be separated from variability in the federal funds rate, whose potential is determined by the width of the spread. Due to this inelasticity, the Fed is able to alter the federal funds rate without altering the quantity of reserve balances at all, regardless of the width of the spread. Footnote 4. While a change in the federal funds rate might alter deposits, and therefore reserve requirements, and the demand for reserve balances, this change occurs with a lag. Regardless, any change to reserve balances would be the result of the change in the federal funds target, which might then affect deposits and reserve requirements. This is distinct from a liquidity effect, where a change in reserve balances is necessary to move the federal funds rate to a new target. Recall that banks cannot use reserve balances for anything other than settling payments or meeting reserve requirements. They do not fund additional lending. The case of Japan, where interest rates were near zero while demand deposits creation stagnated, demonstrates that such effects on deposits from low interest rates are far from certain at any rate. With interest-bearing reserve balances, clearly the Fed could simply alter both the primary lending rate and rate paid on reserve balances together to move the federal funds rate to a new target. This would again be consistent with the Fed's preferred practice of simply announcing a new target rate and preferable to earlier times, pre-1994, when federal funds traders learned of a new target through the Fed's signals sent via open market operations that would later be offset. In summary, as the Fed itself argues, its ability to manage the federal funds rate would be simplified through interest payment on reserve balances. More importantly, and much like consideration of the Fed's operations without reserve requirements, considering monetary operations with a narrow spread, where reserve balances are interest-bearing, is a useful starting point, or even general case, for understanding their nature. With a narrow spread, the Fed accommodates the demand for reserve balances in real time and is able to adjust the federal funds rate target without additional operations by simply raising or lowering the bid and ask rates on reserve balances. There is no question that the Fed can achieve the federal funds rate target with minimal volatility and also alter the target as desired via announcement. With a wide spread, Fed operations must anticipate banks' demand for reserve balances to avoid swings in the federal funds rate. Nonetheless, changes to the federal funds rate target, even with a wide spread, require essentially no change to reserve balances since banks can do nothing more than settle payments and meet reserve requirements with them. Because the general and special cases have been historically confused, economists have been led to publish volumes of research on deposit multipliers, liquidity effects, and the possibility that the Fed might not be able to manage volatility in the federal funds rate.